Welcome, everyone, to I4CP's Next Practices Weekly. Great to have folks back with us. I recognize a lot of returning names over in the chat. Please do introduce yourself over there. Let us know where you're joining from, and then keep that chat window open because that'll be your opportunity to make comments and ask questions once we get into the conversation today. If you're new to Next Practices Weekly, new to I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're your human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that drive performance, drive high performance. We do this through our major studies each year, of which we do 4 to 8. We also do a number of medium-sized studies, pulse surveys, create a lot of tools for our members. We define high performance by these 4 pretty standard business metrics: revenue growth, profitability, market share, and customer satisfaction. And what we like to hone in on and really tease out in our studies is what high-performing companies are doing differently than low performers across all different areas of human practice, human resources. We are a member-based community, so special welcome to anyone on the call who's with one of our member companies. You see here just a small sampling of some of the logos. They really range from large organizations like 3M and Microsoft, Visa, Amazon, Accenture. We've got a lot of smaller companies and maybe the 1 to 10,000 employee range. We've got regional banks, hospitals, healthcare organizations, you name it. So if you're not with a member organization, would like to learn more about what that entails, just drop an email to anyone at I4CP or visit us out at i4cp.com. We'd be happy to get you that information. My name's Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP. Great to be with you all again this week. And this week I am pleased to have our co-founder, Mr. Kevin Oakes, on the line as our co-host this week. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning, Tom. Good to see everybody.
Good to be with you, and you're going to facilitate the conversation with our special guest in just a few minutes. But until then, a couple of other quick reminders and programming notes. We do have some upcoming events there highlighted on the right. This is Next Practices Weekly, and we're just highlighting a few of the events that we have coming up for the rest of May into June and into July. You see, May 22nd will be a pretty special one. We've got Van Jones, who many of you know from his time at CNN. He's going to be talking about AI and sort of the human side of this new technology, coming up with some work that he's been doing lately. And then you see we've got Samantha Dubridge, Vice President of HR at HPE, on June 12th. And then a whole group of talent leaders from Cox Enterprises will be joining us on July 10th. One last thing before we get to our special guest for today and get the conversation going. We have been advertising this the last couple of months, really, here at Next Practices Weekly, and that's our Workforce Readiness in the Era of AI study. We've got an executive brief that you can download either using the QR code on the screen or the link that is over in the chat. That's available to everyone. That's open to the public. And of course, members get access to the full report and several tools that we've created along with this study. We've been making presentations on this really around the globe, many of us on the team presenting on some pretty fascinating findings and data that came out of this study earlier this year. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Kevin, to introduce our special guest.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to see so many people joining us for this topic. And I'm thrilled that Brian's joined us yet again. But before I formally introduce Brian, let me just kind of say this up front. It's going to come as no surprise to anyone who's followed what either Brian's written or said, or what I've written, or Tom. We're all fans of flexible and remote work. We all work flexibly. I'll say this for myself. I was in the office actually 3 days this week, which is a lot, frankly, in a given week. But today I'm not in the office. But the focus of today's conversation is something that's been requested by several of our members. And now that we have an in-office policy, maybe it's 3 days a week, maybe it's 5 days a week, how do we maximize that experience? And so we're looking forward to having that conversation with you. And we do want it to be more of a conversation. So please, use that chat box as much as you can. Ask us questions, put your comments in there, and we'll try to be monitoring that throughout the conversation. But as I said at the beginning, I'm thrilled, Brian, that you're here with us. We recently had you as a guest earlier this year on Next Practices Weekly in January. And then we also had you as a featured keynote at our Next Practices Now conference that we hold each year down in Scottsdale, Arizona in early March. Feels like we're on an every 2-month cycle here with you, Brian, which I love.
I'm darkening your doorstep yet again. Yes.
That's right. So for those, there's probably some on the call that don't know you. So let me just turn it over to you and have you briefly introduce yourself and, describe some of your background, Brian.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Tom and team, for having me here again. So I'm Brian Elliott. I lead an organization called Work Forward. We're an advisory shop that helps leaders navigate the future of work. I spent 25 years in tech as a leader, startup CEO, Google and Slack, where I led business units, product and technology teams, engineering, you name it. But then I founded a group called Future Forum in 2020 that did research around workplace flexibility. I got known for the sort of pulse that we did every quarter of opinions of working people around the globe. And since then, I've continued on that set of themes and continue to have these conversations with folks on a regular basis. And Kevin, I think this one came out of the time we had in Arizona and some people walking up to some degree and saying, hey, look, it's great. I'm actually a big proponent of flexibility myself, but I'm feeling a little stuck because we've made the decision. We've put in place this policy, or certainly our CEO wants to put in place this policy. And what advice do you have for me? And that's not an irregular conversation over the past 6 months.
Yeah, I've certainly had that same conversation with a lot of CHROs and a lot of others in organizations. And there was even a headline last week in an article I was reading that RTO is going poorly in general. I'm sure some companies feel like they've done it really well, but a lot of companies feel like they're struggling with it. And so, how can HR smooth out that process overall? And I know we want to share some data here, Brian, and we also just want to get into some practices that we've seen work within organizations. So I know you've brought a lot of data here with you to kind of back up what's happening from a return to office perspective.
Yeah, and we can probably flip on to the next one, Tom. This is just the headlines. The only thing I'd say on those headlines is the only one that turned out not to be correct was that Axios one that said the return to office wars are over. That was honestly, I think, wishful thinking on my part as well as the journalists back last Labor Day, because it was about 3 days later that Andy Jassy put out his memo saying 5 days a week come January 2025. Here's Flex Index data. This is from Q4 of last year. There may be some news coming shortly on this one, I hope. But as of the end of last year, structured hybrid was clearly in the lead and continuing to grow faster than anything else. If you think about like what happened post-pandemic, people shifted, their mindset around this pretty dramatically. Most people aren't talking about full-time in the office. Even the calls I get from chief human resource officers over the past 6 months typically aren't about the 5-day a week, Andy Jassy, Caterpillar style. It's more often someone's talking about 3 days a week or 4 days a week and how that's going to work. So you see some of the data on that one. Let's keep going a little bit.
Brian, it might make sense to just even give a quick description of Flex Index too.
Yeah, so Flex Index actually is an organization that tracks 13,000 companies' workplace flexibility policies around the globe, roughly 8,500 in the US alone. And they get it from publicly available data. Employees also come in and adjust and correct and update the data as it goes along. And it's trying to help stratify companies into different buckets. The buckets are fully remote, meaning everybody's sort of on their own, and maybe you bring people together for a gathering a couple of times a year, like Zapier does. Employee choice, which is the Atlassian style model, where you've got access to offices for teams and people that need them, but the decision-making process is at the individual and team level. Structured hybrid, which is what I think most of us are familiar with a variety of variations underneath the hood on that one. How many days a week is the right answer? Is it a specific set of days? Is it a percentage that you're using? Where do you set the boundary conditions around this? And then full-time on-site. And so Flex Index has been tracking that. This is the data from last Q4. So 2025 should be interesting to see what happens next. Next up on this one is a study from Nick Bloom that he and his team did along with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, actually, where they polled roughly 1,300 senior executives in firms and asked them, did they plan on increasing their return to office mandate? in 2025? The answer was 12% of firms out there were planning on increasing their mandate. When asked, though, interestingly, will you crank it up even more in a recession? Because a lot of people expect that as the job market gets, tougher for employees, that's part of what's driving the mandates so far. The number only jumps to 14%, so it's not like a massive increase here. There's a slight bump northward. There actually, interestingly, was like a 1 or 2% of CEOs who said they were going to go the opposite direction, meaning if there was a recession, they actually would decrease and they would push more towards remote, probably because they're planning on shedding some office space or shedding even more office space. Here's the big deal. All the commands are, we'll see what happens next on the Flex Index front, but the policy making so far has not exactly resulted in a lot of significant traffic coming back into the office. I publish this stuff on a semi-regular basis. The QR code takes you to my newsletter. There's about once a month, I drop in a link to a 50-page slide deck on this. But this data right here on the chart at the moment is Nick Bloom and team's Stanford data, along with U.S. Census data showing percentage of days worked from home, which you can see from 2023 forward, roughly speaking, has been flat. If anything, pretty darn flat the past year or so. And hit the next one. This is Castle Systems data, pretty much flat, maybe a 2% increase. And the last one is Placer AI. So Castle System tracks badges in a bunch of offices. Placer tracks cell phone usage in offices. So they're looking at office traffic. And what you see on that one on a year-on-year basis in the first quarter of this year is the number versus where we were. The origin point on these things is always a little weird. It's like, where were we pre-pandemic, right? So where were we before the pandemic? And the answer on this one is we're about 35% below pre-pandemic norms from a Placer perspective. We're at about 50% if you look at Castle. But either or any of these three sources basically say, yeah, you're cranking up the commands, but people aren't really doing it. So we'll get a bit today into why that's happening. Last bit on the sort of office utilization data is back to that issue of what was the origin point of those stories, meaning if you've got a CEO in particular who thinks that in 2019, everybody was in the office 5 days a week, I have some news that's not accurate. We were surprised ourselves at Slack because we were office-centric pre-pandemic. We started this conversation in 2021 about reopening our headquarters in San Francisco. And the person who ran the office said, yeah, we only need, so many spaces to be opened up. And the CEO said, well, if we open it up, won't we get 80% plus occupancy? And she goes, no, we averaged 50% prior to the pandemic. And that's true pretty broadly. If you talk to workplace professionals, 50 to 60% was your average. It's not your max. And that's an important note when you think about office sizing. But if you're thinking about like the metric around what percentage of the time are people going to be in the office between sick days, vacation, customer visits, and people who already had a flexible work from home deal, Cushman & Wakefield says the number was 51%. JLL has that range that you can see, but 60%-ish. So your CEO should not be expecting, if you say 5, that you're going to get 4 or 5. You might get 3. And by the way, that may be what they're after.
It's such an important point because I think the assumption has been that, we're much closer to like 90%, in the office, and it never was that way.
That's right.
And I think we have to set our expectations appropriately today. One question that has already come up that I thought would be a good sort of opening question after we get through some of this data, Brian. Ashley Graham asked, a genuine question, why the push to return to office? And I think we all have a lot of thoughts on that, but I want to make sure we get that one out of the way.
Oh, yeah, we'll dig into that one. So, yeah, Kevin, to your point, the other one I've seen consistently is, 2 years ago, we said 3 days a week. The CEO wasn't thrilled with 3, but he would settle at 3. And somebody said, and I almost always drop the number and say, you're getting 1.5 to 2. And everybody goes, yeah, I'm getting 1.5 to 2. I'm like, yeah, that's what you should expect, to be honest. Because if you're back when we were in 5, you were getting 3. At 3, you're going to get 2 at most. This is Gallup data. They update this on a regular basis. It shows engagement by employee work location model. And the line that's blue that sort of drops is sort of the funky line to pay attention to. The top 2 rows are fully remote and hybrid, and it shows the engagement for those groups is pretty consistent. Measure on measure on measure on measure, right? That's sort of flat. The red line is people who have to work on site full-time for their job, frontline workers, and it's consistently low. The blue line is people who are being told they have to work in the office 5 days a week when they could work from home part of the time. And it's the one that has the interesting note because it drops. Before the pandemic, the start of this chart, it was about the same as hybrid or fully remote. By the time you hit 2021, 22, 23, there's this big delta. That's because in 2019, we didn't know any better. Right. I was part of that camp, right? I commuted to an office 5 days a week for 25 years, 30 years. And, we all had the expectation that the office is where work was done and how it got done. So now what's changed is people's understanding of what's possible. So if you're not even giving them a couple of days a week, you shouldn't be surprised when their engagement drops like a stone. And you shouldn't be surprised when you start forcing them back 5 days, the engagement drops as well. Last note, from a data perspective, the other thing that I try to get people to wrap their heads around with senior execs in particular is this is not an issue of hybrid is hard. This is an issue of managing and leading distributed teams is hard. And we're not in a world of remote work. We're in a world of distributed teams. And that's the thing that I really need us to all help wrap our heads around, because if you're in a larger organization, you get this. There may be teams, sales, engineering, where you've got pods of people who are co-located with their manager. But more often than not, even those teams are spread out. But I almost guarantee you, your project-based work, your cross-functional work is being done by people who work in different buildings, most often in different cities and different locations. And so the leadership across those types of efforts has to be done differently than the assumption that someone showing up and sitting next to you is the way that you're going to collaborate, is the way you're going to convey information, is the way you're going to do mentorship even. And so we're in a world in which distributed is becoming the norm, and we need to come to terms with that one and learn how to lead around it.
And Brian, we have a brand new research report that we're going to be publishing soon around this subject specifically, leadership in a distributed work era. Because this has gotten remarkably harder for leaders to manage, and it's not all about location either. That distribution goes across many different aspects of being part of a team. And I don't want to get down this path too much, but even around agentic AI and how AI is going to be part of teams going forward. So we've explored that with hundreds of interviews and some survey data. And it's really fascinating how some of those successful leaders are having success, but just how complex this is becoming for leaders.
Yeah, I saw you guys had a preview in Scottsdale. I've been waiting for you guys to make that.
Yeah, and actually we did a little bit of a deeper dive already with Rob Cross, who was our lead on that study here on Next Practices Weekly. So I'll ask Zeta to find the link for that particular episode and put it in the chat, because if you missed that one a few weeks ago, he went a little bit deeper than his preview in Scottsdale, although, as Kevin said, the full report will be coming out soon.
That's excellent. Moving on. So here's the set of things that I've been asked about this enough times. I think I've published a similar piece of work, and you guys have actually used this to some degree too, to say when your CEO comes to you, let's assume that you're still in the spot of having the discussion as opposed to the decision's been made and now you're living with it. First question is always, what problem are we trying to solve? How much of this is actually something where we can point to a real problem in the business? And I have seen real problems. I've seen issues where junior salespeople, for example, who are co-located and regionally based, who could be in the office more often, aren't there, and their performance is faltering. But more often than not, that's not the proximate cause. It's too often I hear the story, which is my CEO just came back from a meeting with a bunch of other CEOs, and he's very fired up and ready to go. Or we said 3 days a couple of years ago, he's coming in only seeing people sporadically. He's ticked off. And by the way, I'm using the word he intentionally. It's always a he. That's almost always a he that's doing this. Number two, what's our talent strategy? This gets into the issue of who are we after? Are we after people who have a choice in this? Back to this issue of compliance. The other thing that does happen that there's evidence behind is that people who have more marketable skills tend to leave. So are you going to really enforce a 5-day-a-week mandate on your data scientists? If you're Amazon, you might be able to do that bluntly, because people may line up behind the door to do it. But also, you're then putting your managers in a position of of managing the fact that the compliance isn't happening, and what are they going to do? Are they really going to allow it to terminate someone who's actually performing well? So what position are we putting our managers in? Third, are our teams co-located or are they distributed? This is back to that issue of distributed teams. The issue that Jamie Dimon got pushed on was by someone who didn't just have this as a personal need. What he was saying was that my team is an IT team that's globally distributed. Matter of fact, no one was in the same office. So, can I have a little bit of leniency here? Because it's not just the fact that it doesn't make logical sense to my team. It also disrupts our flow because we have to collaborate across time zones. Does this really one-size approach work, or should we think about what happens across different functions within the business? I've seen that one be reasonably successful in terms of the differences between those junior salespeople and other parts of the organization. And the last one, and the hardest one, is back to a really big culture and engagement issue, which is, would we really enforce this? Really enforce it? There's actually pretty good evidence that even Amazon is not actually really enforcing it. There are people on whom it is being enforced, but it's selective. And when you get to selective enforcement, we all know that becomes problematic.
Well, and I think, if you combine those last two there, what we've seen in the one-size-fit-all policies is you immediately create exceptions. There are going to be certain superstars in the organization that don't want to go along with this, that the company makes an exception for, or there's a variety of situations that you make an exception for. So are you really enforcing it overall? Probably not. And one example I was just thinking about and reading about was NVIDIA. You have in a lot of companies very different types of employees. So NVIDIA, one of the most highest valuations for a company in the world, they've got people that have to be on site from a hardware perspective, in the lab, and have to be hands-on. And then a lot of software folks who have teams that are distributed across time zones all over the world, where being on site doesn't really matter. And so, how do you create, a one-size-fits-all policy across environments like that?
It's really hard and it's really challenging. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I worked with a defense contractor where the CEO got up in front of his 150 top senior leaders and said, "I know about a third of you would like me to declare an answer for you. That's not my job.
Yeah,
It's your job."
good point.
We have 6 business units. We have functions that are highly complex that have different needs. It's not my job to actually make all these decisions. That's why we have a leadership team in the first place. So I'm going to dive into this one. I dropped a link to one of these. There's a lot of questions in the chat that are actually fantastic and good conversations. We will get the content out as well. So there's a set of challenges that people face when it comes to this in terms of why do you get the resistance in the first place. And there are sort of degrees of challenge here. One is, what's the degree of change in the first place? So if you're asking employees to relocate in order to be with their team, which Amazon did, and which Walmart has done to some degree also, you do that with the understanding that you're going to lose people and potentially by sizable numbers. But that also breeds resentment among folks in ways I think we all kind of understand. But that's probably the biggest one that results in a massive shift. The second one, third one are ones where, especially for my friends who are in federal government agencies, the stories here have been fairly horrific. But even if you think about what Amazon did, they actually postponed their return to office in 40 locations in the US because they didn't have enough space. And in at least a number of those locations, it still isn't happening because the space just isn't available. If you're saying come back to the office, but people are having to cram themselves in the case of some of the federal agencies, into break rooms and hallways and working off the top of trash cans, this is not going to do anything to boost productivity, collaboration, or clearly morale. Parking space considerations are big. Technology concerns. The Wi-Fi is getting better in a lot of places, but not great. And the bigger issue is the world we left in 2019 not only had open office floor plans that, sort of worked, but sort of didn't, and not enough meeting spaces. That's gotten worse. But the other thing that's happened is so much more of our world is now video-based meetings. And if you got a whole mess of people taking video-based meetings in open spaces, it's loud, it's bandwidth consumptive, and it's really challenging. Not to mention the number of people, I'm sure we've all seen this, where someone's doing their work from a conference room and they have forgotten how the conference room equipment works and how to share as they go along. And the last one is just the team dynamics issue. The feedback that you get pretty quickly is the feedback to Jamie Dimon style stuff, which is, I get how that makes sense for this group of people here, but it doesn't make sense for my team and how my team operates. Let's keep going.
Well,
did I glitch?
No, I'm still here. I think we're all.
But I lost the screen there for a minute. So
yeah. Okay, there we go.
Oh, there you go. I was going to say.
Sorry about that, guys.
Okay, no worries. So I think let's keep this going as we talk about best and next practices and communication and how you can be effective around this, Brian.
Yeah. There's a couple things here. This assumes that you've come to the decision as an executive team, or the decision's been made as an executive team that you're going to do this, and there's a number that's coming forward, and you're prepping for it. First thing is leadership readiness. There's a look around the table thing that has to happen in the executive suite that says, how are we all going to respond to this? Because this is one of those moments that may seem minor but can be disruptive. I remember being in another session with a group of CHROs, and one of them said, we handled a lot of things over the course of the past 5 years that have been really rough. Vaccine mandates, George Floyd, economic recession concerns, everything else. And the C-suite managed to get aligned pretty quickly. This return to office thing is one where it's really hard to even get the C-suite aligned. And that's usually because you've got someone in the room who's got a different pattern and habit for their team. So your tech team, for example, might be more distributed, or your sales team might be more distributed. But your leadership team has to have a conversation about what's a reasonable set of conversations we're going to have with people, and how do we either stand behind it or how do we allow for adjustments to the message that are appropriate for how those businesses work. Because if you don't do that, if you're not ready for that, it's going to come at you anyway. Second, when you're communicating, the more you can invert the message, the better. Meaning, I've actually seen people have more success with, hey, there's a set of activities that we think actually are better done in person, and they are very specifically this set of things. And if you add those up, that's probably 2 or 3 days a week in the office. And so therefore, we expect people to probably be in 3 to 4 days a week. That's a soft pedaling of it, but it actually can work reasonably well. I'll give you another example of that. I just put on LinkedIn today's newsletter, which is about Airbnb. Airbnb rolled out 5-6 months ago. It's a monthly in-person cadence for a large portion of their employee base in sort of product design, engineering, marketing. And that announcement, while it's only once a month for 3 or 4 days, involves travel, involves people coming together, and is still hey, you're going to do this. But the way they handled it was super smooth in terms of language, in terms of the invitation, in terms of prepping people, in terms of saying, here's the weeks it's going to happen on, in terms of being able to explain why, because it tied completely into the milestones of their product development cycle. And their backlash was zero. In fact, people were pretty happy to do it because they got why it happened, and it was fun because it was once a month. So the more you can invert the communications, the better, the more that you have something that aligns with what people will understand is the rhythm of the business, the purpose of the business, the better. If you're not in that position, you need to have your FAQ ready around the logic gaps, right? You need to be able to answer the question that got asked to Jamie Dimon, which is, my team is spread out across the globe. And we'll come to some of the issues around like, what are reasonable accommodations? And last one is advance notice. There's a huge difference between Amazon saying in the fall, we need people back 5 days a week in January, and the Feds saying you've got 4 days to relocate. That's probably.
Brian, before we move on to the second half of the slide, reasonable accommodations, I think we've had maybe half dozen folks in the chat that have been just really asking the question, but also offering some insights into and wanting from you, your insights into the why here. What are the studies? What are the reasons that CEOs in particular, but maybe other leaders are sometimes pushing for this? And I'd just like to read Jessica's chat comment in particular, because she listed a few things. Can you talk more about the root cause for organizations leaders to push or mandate return to office. I have heard and read that it is due to creative limitations, lack of trust, leadership traditional beliefs about on-site work, general comfort levels they may have. But aren't these just excuses? And now I know that there's a study that many point to from years ago that came out of India that was pretty flawed because of the nature of that study that many sort of just knee-jerk pointed to. But have there been other better studies, or what's your take on all of this?
There have been a number of studies there, and I'll be open to, like, the studies are all over the place. I linked to a whole mess of them within my own research and work, and share it out, so folks should feel free to grab it. There are studies that get at almost every aspect of this. There are a couple of areas that are really clear, which is hybrid works. I have yet to find a single study that says 5 days a week is a better answer for anything. Period. Full stop. I have seen studies, including work by Raj Chowdhury out of Harvard Business School, that are really high quality, that get at the fact that in many cases, some form of regular get-together actually is more beneficial, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. It also happens to be what most people want. And one of the interesting things he did with one of these studies is teams could actually figure out whether the cadence, by the way, the answer in this particular study was 25%. It was 25 to 40% of time spent together with your team was where you kind of got the peak of collaboration, creative idea generation, engagement, well-being, a whole bunch of stuff on that one. And the answer, though, wasn't therefore 2 days a week. The answer was figure out what works for your team. And so some teams were doing 1 or 2 days a week. Other teams ended up doing once a month. And those are the teams that actually perform better. Creativity and innovation, a bunch of this is mythology, to be blunt. Water coolers and whiteboards, and the happenstance that's gonna, that great creative spark and idea. Again, I'll use Airbnb just because it's timely. This week they launched this gigantic, massive update to their services and expansion that was done with people being, primarily working from all over the place. But I think the word traditional that Ashley used in that is exactly right. Look, I'm guilty of this myself, right? We fall back on our own, what worked for us in conventional wisdom. And there's some combination there of what worked for me is what's going to make us successful. There are CEOs who are under tremendous pressure. We shouldn't pull out violins all the time, but it's true, right? CEO turnover is, back to all-time highs. The pressure to perform is up there. And so they get nervous and anxious when they perceive that people aren't really engaged with the business. There's also a challenge there, which is they're often not in the tools the teams are using to see what's going on in the conversation. And some of it is just some of it is back to that particular set of, issues around the way I came through the system works this way, and it worked for me, so it's going to work for other people, which we all know has never been true in the first place. Some of it is, the set of issues around concerns about control and resentment around people not complying. Then there are at times, though, specific issues, and we should face those and address those specific issues, like the sales one that I described earlier.
It's also just kind of a big lever a CEO can pull if they're trying to, make rapid change, especially if the business is suffering. And when somebody like Amazon, creates a 5-day return to work policy, that gives other CEOs air cover, right? To do the same thing. I was reading a study a couple days ago, though, Brian, about well-being, and it came out of Switzerland, and it found in a hybrid environment there were numerous well-being benefits to workers. Almost 40% were taking fewer sick days. 3/4 were making more time for preventative health care. Almost 3/4 were experiencing less stress. It goes on and on. So I think there are significant well-being aspects to this as well.
Yeah, and I think there is no answer here where fully remote is actually the right answer, meaning fully remote and never together. I actually am not a big fan of fully remote because I don't think it works for most people. And I don't think it works for most organizations. They're trying to transferring to a fully remote organization is really hard. And even the ones that are fully remote get people together at least a couple of times a year. I think that's a bridge too far for most larger organizations to cross. But I think the answer of like a uniform policy across the entire organization is also one that doesn't work. So there's an in-between here that you need to find, but it requires work. It requires that you work this out at the team level and also shift your mindset away from I'm going to monitor people through behinds and seats, or through their presence, whether that's, the green light in Slack, whether that's their faces on. You got to move to outcomes-based management of people also. And that's one of the bigger challenges for organizations often, but it's also a huge unlock of business performance. Reasonable accommodations. You need to have this conversation up front too, so the leaders are on the same page. What are you willing to give? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to not do? What are reasonable ways in which people could sit there and say, "Hey, this isn't great." I know people who hate coffee badging, meaning someone shows up for 3 hours in order to do the badge swipe, and I know people who are perfectly fine with it, because if you're there for the 3 hours that matter the most for when your team meetings are, and you're shortening your commute in order to do that, that's great. Core hour requirements. For all the discussion about number of days a week, the hours that you make available to your team is actually more important. And this is an issue that spans back into the distributed team concept, which is a lot of teams are spread across time zones. What's the core set of hours, 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. West Coast, noon until 4, Monday through Thursday, that everybody makes available, and you do not schedule doctor's appointments and kid pickups and other stuff like that during those hours, so that you've got something dealt with. Time zone adjustments, meaning if you're on that IT team that's spread across time zones, do you get an accommodation? Dell used to do this. I'm not sure they still do. Caregivers, this is one of the biggest issues. If you look at the data on mandates, the people who are most likely to leave, and McKinsey, by the way, says the number was 17% in a study they put out a couple weeks ago of people take off after a mandate, which surprised me. That's a big number. But the people most likely to leave are highly talented people and women, in particular caregivers, that basically face a higher burden of support at home. And last and not least, by any stretch of the imagination, accessibility accommodations. And what are you going to do on that front, and how are you going to handle it?
So I think all of these speak to that one size fits all just does not work. So when you put these policies in, Brian, you've got to make sure that you're being, somewhat accommodating to different situations. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And all these are basically coming back to, in some ways, what is the leader's responsibility in this, which is how do you think through this from a logic perspective about what's reasonable here and what you're trying to accomplish. And understanding what your goal is in the first place is actually important. If part of this is about, hey, I'm trying to build something in which I can get people together on a regular basis just to build, team relationships and camaraderie, 5 days a week and 9 to 5 is probably not the answer. And you can probably flex on a lot of other things. 3 days may not be either.
How much autonomy should organizations give to individual managers in these situations, Brian?
I think they have to. And the answer is managers are going to use it anyway.
Right.
So I think that's part of where you're seeing the difference between policy and compliance show up is, and I talked with OccuSpace is one of the sensor firms. Nick Halberin runs it. They track 50 million square feet of office occupancy. And he's got clients that are 5 days a week and threatening to fire you if you don't show up. He's got firms that are 3 day a week, loose guidance, and he's got firms that are employee choice. His take was the actual seat occupancy across those 3 organizations is about the same. There's not a huge difference. And why is that? It's because a manager who's faced with the rising demands of 2024, 2025 to do more with less, to crank it out, to drive Gen AI adoption, all the rest of it, if they've got good performers on their team, and I'm sorry to the HR person who had to produce the report, but the report that shows up on their desk, virtual desk, that says, hey, of your 12 people, 3 of them are not complying with policy, or 6 of them are not complying with policy, or 10. It's going to go in the round bin if those people are actually performing. It will be used if someone is underperforming, and that can be important, meaning if I've got people where I can see that they are underperforming, they're not hitting their numbers, they're not reaching their goals, then that compliance report can be helpful, but I bet the manager already knows it. Monitoring. Oh my God, I already started on this one, didn't I? I actually do think, look, utilization data actually is critical. And there is the base level of we need to know office occupancy in order to have better offices. We need to understand better what part of an office someone is using. there's better and better tools out there for doing this. That sensors can go a long way, but honestly, there's people are building really cool stuff using tracking of devices in spaces. Which, yes, we can get into all the privacy concerns, but if it's anonymized, understanding whether or not your spaces are being actively used, where are your hot spots, where are your loose spots, is really important for your workplace team to be able to re-engineer and redesign to fit your needs. So that's base level.
I read a great quote recently that said, offices are built for humans, but we've spent very little time studying how humans use offices.
Yeah. Yep. And in fact, there's probably, like, there's been massive shifts and pressure put on people teams. There's been even bigger shifts in some ways placed against workplace teams, right? There are teams out there that, basically had the mandate to stamp out the same thing around the globe for 20 years. And the assumption that it was working for folks. And now we know that it's not working. And there's just a massive lift in making the shifts to actually rethinking that. And there's some great examples that I've got of people that we might get into one or two of those as well. If you are tracking the data, however, you then have to think about, like, being transparent about the fact that you are doing so, setting realistic expectations. This is back to my issue of, if 5 days was the norm pre-pandemic and we got 2.5 to 3, when you're doing 3, you should expect to get 2, and you should adjust the data. Don't give somebody the red mark next to their name because they took vacation last month. That's kind of bad. I have seen firms that have actually used this and done it fairly effectively because it's actually shared with the individual and the manager. So the individual and the manager both see it. There's actually some benefit to doing that with that level of transparency, so somebody doesn't think there's something being held over their head that they don't know about. But at the end of the day, the much better answer on all this is to focus on, how do I actually balance that out with outcomes? How do I move myself into a position where my managers actually have much better handle on the quarter-to-quarter goals they expect out of their teams, the measurement of them, the determination of impact, and then the compliance is, basically a subordinate tool used for someone who's having a performance issue, as opposed to the other way around.
Wanted to bring in one question from the chat before we move on. Kim asks you that in response to something you said, you mentioned women and caregivers are impacted more by return to office policies. Do you have recommended studies supporting engagement for these groups, things like employee resource groups, engagement committees, and so on? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, part of it is just listening to people broadly in the first place, and understanding, what the needs and challenges are that they're facing. There's a great HBR article that popped just in a week or two ago, too, kind of trying to help understand the difference between the sort of command and control return that we've got now and the sort of care mentality. This is basically back to human-centered leadership, which is, you've got different teams and of groups of people that have different needs. They will express to you what they need if you listen to them, and giving them those kinds of accommodations that make logical sense are also good for your business. We did this during the pandemic. We all sort of did it, but for example, at Slack, one of the early learnings we had from our abilities ERG was understanding that people who were reliant on lip reading in order to understand people were really struggling because if someone had their camera off, it wasn't really going to do any good, right? So camera on or transcription enabled in Zoom as a default ends up being something that's really important. So any of these things that can feel like, I have to listen to this group about their issue, turns out actually to be something that can either enable them to be a really great worker or is going to hold them back. So I do think that, especially for, like, the data, by the way, says that it's not just women who are caregivers, it's women, period, who prefer to work from home more often than men. It's more often than not the male CEO who thinks that everything's working and worked for him because it worked for him that wants the mandate.
I think the last topic we had teed up for you, and then we'll have some time to hit some of the other questions that have come up in the chat. But office space. Yeah,
this is a fun one because there are a bunch of firms out there. The example here is from PagerDuty, Atlassian, Dropbox, Zillow, Allstate, Target, others that have basically said, hey, look, we know we're not going backwards, so what are we doing going forward? And they have redesigned the spaces that they've got. They've shrunk square footage. what they've done is a pretty massive redesign of the space that they kept to make it more appropriate for collaboration in today's world. So inverting the 80-20 to be 20-80. So if you used to be like 60% of your space for heads down individual work, the answer is that's probably 20% going forward. And that's a pretty major shift. And then the other one that they've done a lot is we have treated these as sort of fixed locations with fixed and hard walls and everything's bolted down. One of my favorites is the Atlassian office down in Austin. I got a tour of a couple weeks ago. Everything is modular. You can you can bring movers in and move any furniture around that you want to. So if it turns out you're wrong about the allocation of space that you need and you need more team collaborative space and less heads down workspace, you reconfigure with movers as opposed to big expensive CapEx projects. There's a bigger delta here too, which is those facilities teams are also doing a lot more to provide facilitation for team gatherings and getting people together. But the last thing I'd say on this is that's the people that are moving ahead. There's a whole bunch of them that you can learn from. I know a lot of workplace leaders who just feel frozen, and it's not because of them. It's because the C-suite is saying, hey, look, this is finally the year we're going to get everybody back. So no, I don't want to shrink my footprint. No, I don't want to give you the money to do redesign work, even though those workplace professionals know that they need to actually shrink footprint, free up some funds, and do some redesign work. So at some point in time, you got to look at this and say, hey, look, I've got a somewhat money-saving opportunity, but I got a bigger issue, which is, are my offices actually fit for purpose these days in the first place?
Yeah, and I think pointing organizations to articles and examples like this is really important, Brian. We have very little data, as I said earlier, about what is working from a physical perspective in offices.
Yeah.
And I think the more data we can throw at the C-suite, the better. We've all heard the countless stories of mandates happen and then everybody comes back to the office and there's not enough space and there's it overloads the Wi-Fi, et cetera. I've seen in person this happen many times where you got people camped out in a conference room, even though you've reserved some time in that room, and just setting up the right rules and governance around this, but also just the right physical layout is so critical.
Yeah. There's one other factor that a lot of those folks are doing that I wanted to touch on briefly because I've seen a couple of bits in this pop in. If you look even at the firms that are remote first, that are more flexible in nature, they are actually doing things that actually lead to more junior staff being hired in fewer locations because those people do prefer to be together and they are going to get benefit from doing it. So if you look at, this is like the employee choice firms, the Atlassians, the PagerDuties, the Dropboxes, the Zillows, the Allstates of the world. Instead of hiring people on much more spread out locations, they'll concentrate undergrad hiring, new employee hiring at junior levels in a couple of locations to give them the sort of mentorship and guidance and honestly the socialization that they're looking for. The other is I've seen firms actually design programs where specific roles start off in office. So Allstate does this with their claims agents. You're 2 weeks in the office for training. You're 6 weeks then through sort of a prove-out cycle. After that, after 2 months, the job, you are capable of it, or you've moved on. And your manager has tools by which they can measure and monitor your progress and check in on you anyway, and you can go work wherever you want to. So there's models here that vary dependent not just on what's the performance of a sales organization, but what level is a person in the organization and sort of speed the ramp time for certain employees.
I'm glad you mentioned that about, because we were getting some questions on that or points being made about either younger workers or maybe better to say newer in role, which often includes many younger workers.
Thank you.
Have you seen any that maybe you just mentioned, 6 weeks, 2 months? Have you seen any that maybe have a longer, like 1 year ramp up period and then relax to a little bit more of a hybrid or fully remote? Because there's only so much you can do in the first 6 weeks. You're being bombarded with fire hose of information and so on. Your immediate onboarding, often onboarding cycles last a full year.
Yeah, and it really depends on the job type. I mean, a claims agent is a very different job than a product manager, right? A claims agent is actually learning a job that is largely individual in nature in the first place. And so over the course of 2 months, you're definitely going to learn that job because it's the job you're going to be primarily doing. It's customer support, customer success to some degree. Claims agents or people that are dealing with, customers on the other end of it. If I'm a product manager, it may take a longer period of time. And so I have seen people do things where early on it's a 2 or 3 day a week in the office. There's not really a benefit that 5 gets you on for a year-long basis because, matter of fact, Microsoft had some data that showed the opposite is true. Even for new hires, there's benefit in the first month in particular of being in office 2 or 3 days a week. Those benefits actually turn into negatives if you go up to 5, partly because they're just so fried. They have no time to do any of the catch up on all the rest of the stuff they're trying to figure out. So having some work from home days is actually also really beneficial in terms of the ramp time that people need.
Yeah, and that also gets into what you mentioned earlier, the sort of mythology of the benefits of the water cooler or the drive-by hallway conversations. Everyone who's worked in an office can think of times when they personally have had benefits from that. But what I've always preached on that is people don't look at the net impact of the water cooler conversations, the in-person networking, because there's also negative interactions. And I don't just mean the extremes of harassment situations, but just that annoying person that's always stopping by and talking to you too much, that actually becomes a drain. I mean, we all think of distractions like that. So when you think of the water cooler myth, you need to think, well, is there a net benefit to the water cooler situation, or is it neutral or even negative?
The other thing is you bump into the same people all the time. There's academic studies that show this, right? Like, man, I've forgotten the name of it, but there's an effect that basically says you see the same folks again and again. It helps your strong ties more than it helps your weak ties in a lot of ways. The other one that's my favorite on this is the whole like whiteboard part of the conversation, which is usually held by somebody like me who likes to talk a lot and wants to command the whiteboard. There's actually also studies that show now that used to be that actually there was a drawback to distance in terms of innovation. Like if you look at scientific journal type of stuff, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago, if teams were spread out, then innovation dropped. That actually came to neutral and then inverted around 2015. And the reason why is broadband. All of a sudden, you've got much higher bandwidth access to people on a regular basis to have more in-depth conversations and go deeper. And the other big benefit you get is there's some benefit to more diverse voices in those creative conversations, which you can get if you're not doing it where it's all a live fire exercise in front of a whiteboard, which we all know some people who love the live fire exercise in front of a whiteboard. And we know some people who, cringe at the moment. As a matter of fact, my co-author, Helen Cupp, is one of those people that's like, please, God, don't make me do that. One of the smartest humans I know, but please don't make her, give me the instant answer. It's not fun.
We have a few minutes left. Kevin, I want to give you the floor to ask any final questions you have for Brian.
Well, no, Brian, this is great data, and there's so many things, so many tangents off of this to think about. I guess if you're a company where the CEO has required you to come back into the office, but is pretty staunch on, that this is a policy that applies to everybody, what advice do you give to HR professionals in that situation? How should they best handle this?
I think the best thing that you can do when you're in the position, do you mean like it's been forced all the way through? You're going to have to do it? Yeah. Be a realist. Make sure that people have realistic expectations. Make sure that your C-suite and your CEO understand what's going to be real and what's not in terms of compliance. And you message the decision as best you can, and you manage it through with your leadership team so that everybody's prepared to handle it and to have those conversations. And that's the best thing, honestly, that you can do. Meaning, I think as a team, as a leadership group together, you've got to know that this is not going to be fun, but you're going to get past it. Your organization is going to hear a message that they don't like, but let's make sure we understand what within that message we think is most important. Is it literally the number of days, or is it a set of activities that we want to see people doing that we want to support going forward?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I like what you had talked about earlier on the inverted, sort of build up to the, why we're doing this. But that's not been the reality for some companies, right? They just haven't done that, and they're kind of living with it. I think after the fact, I've seen what really works is what you just said, being honest that, hey, some of you aren't going to like this, right? And this isn't going to work for some of you, and we get that. But here's the positives of why we're doing this. I think that message can.
And you can layer in why. type of things too, right? The problem is you can't layer in why at a high level without sounding like pablum. You say creative and collaborative and productive, and you can't back it up with data because bluntly, there's not data to back it up. So it sounds like pablum. The job actually is for the individual leaders to be able to articulate what specific activities are we going to do together. So I'll give you, they have to do the work to lift it. So my favorite examples come from people like the sales leader I know who said, hey, look, Tuesdays and Wednesdays are in office days. On Tuesday morning, we do the pipeline review because it's really valuable for us to all be in the room and hear from each other and talk it through. And then, by the way, we have an hour and a half long break for lunch where people can go out and catch up with one another. On Wednesdays, we do pitch practice sessions. So in the afternoon, we've got an hour and a half long block where everybody's together, where we're taking turns practicing our pitches, call and response, doing things like that. Those are a couple of activities that people actually get. If instead it's Tuesday and Wednesday are a day in the office, come in the office. Then, yeah, you shouldn't be surprised that people aren't earning the commute at that point in time, right? You got to have some basis for it. The other one that I'll say is the nature of the invitation matters a lot. I know a chief people officer who said, I'm going to be in the office Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm going to have my lunch hour open. I'll eat it, by the way, in the open space. And anybody who wants to join me, come and join me. He's never reinforced it. He's never pushed it. He gets great attendance. By and large, most people want 2 days a week in the office if there are people that they're co-located with in the first place. They want some orchestration of doing it. And a lot of people will do it. Not everybody does. He might get 50 or 60% of his people doing Tuesdays and Thursdays. But for the people who want it, that's really valuable.
But as senior leader,
you will be in.
Yeah, senior leader and executive compliance is a big deal because too often we're seeing these policies laid out, but then senior folks aren't following them. So it's a challenge to make it work.
Yeah. Yep. That's right. And there are like minimums here that I think are important, which is you really should be getting your team together at least once a quarter.
Yeah.
And especially if you've got a distributed team, you got to find the funds to fly people together. And there's plenty of evidence that boosts engagement, boosts understanding. It's how do you balance out the time that you spend then on the business, as well as the relationship development and going deeper and understanding one another. But that's like, to me, just sort of a minimum viable answer.
Well, we're about out of time, but I want to remind folks that if you're interested in data that backs up, anything to do with remote, flexible, hybrid, or in office, we have lots of it. So please feel free to reach out to us, reach out to Brian. He's got tons of data, as he showed. We're happy to support this with data because I think that's what's been missing in this conversation in a lot of organizations is just any specific research and data to back this up. Brian, I want to thank you for joining us today. You're wonderful. You're just a wealth of information. We can see you on TV sometimes, but if you just follow Brian on LinkedIn, he puts out a lot of information on a weekly basis. So thank you, Brian, for everything you do for this community.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Great questions. I wish we had time to tackle all of them.
Right.
And great observations too.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your participation in the chat. It really was a great conversation. I'll double down and also thank you, Brian. Great stuff as always. Appreciate the different angle this time. Thank you, Kevin, for facilitating the conversation today. Want to remind everyone that all Next Practices weekly sessions are available for recertification credit hours from both HRCI and SHRM. So if that applies to you, just jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID that's on the screen and that was put in the chat earlier. Once again, thank you, Brian, Kevin, Zeta, Matt, the whole team that put this together. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day and rest of their week. Bye-bye now.
And thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Gil.